Говорит Москва.
Hier ist Moskau mit einer deutschsprachigen Sendung.
Hello comrades. First of all, I have recently finished watching the first season of the new BBC series World on Fire. Now, while I am enjoying the series, since the programme is based on true historical events like the Nazi invasion of Poland, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Dunkirk and the Nazi invasion of France, there are just a few minor things that I've picked up on while watching the series that I want to point out just in case any of you are interested in watching the series for yourselves. They are just things to be mindful of when watching the series so that you can see the misinterpretations bourgeois historians propagate to us in their campaign of spreading anti-communism. While some facts may be true, the conclusions are usually distorted to be very anti-communist in nature. As an example, one misinterpretation I constantly hear is about the Holodomor. This misinterpretation begins by stating that the Holodomor was a destructive famine that hit Ukraine and had affected much of the Soviet Union. This is true. However, the distortion comes in when the cause of the famine is in question. Western historians, many of whom gather their sources from Ukrainian nationalist organizations who were working very closely with the Nazis in World War II, claim that it was the collectivization of agriculture and the intervention of the Soviet state that caused the famine, which is a distortion. The famine itself was caused by a heat wave, which led to a drought. Tsarist Russia was largely an agrarian society, where industry was non-existent. Capitalism was also not fully developed in the Russian Empire either, as society was also quite feudal in nature. People still owned small means of production, and there was still a monarchy running the country. Society was basically stuck in the 14th century. This meant that in Tsarist Russia, famines were pretty common due to how very backward agriculture was, and also the fact that the peasantry had no control over the land they worked on, since much of the land was owned by landlords. It wasn't until the Bolsheviks came to power and the construction of socialism had begun in the USSR that the country was industrialized and pulled into the modern world. What made the Holodomor famine in Ukraine worse was the sabotage of the collectivization of agriculture by the kulaks, who were hoarding grain, burning crops, and slaughtering livestock to oppose the dictatorship of the proletariat. Therefore, it was actually the collectivization of agriculture and the intervention of the Soviet state to deal with the kulaks that ended the famine, as more mechanized equipment was provided too. This is why I regard George Orwell's Animal Farm as a pile of shite. It portrays Stalin as something that he wasn't, a murdering, bloodthirsty, baby-eating monster. George Orwell also worked very closely with the British government to spread anti-Soviet propaganda, so it definitely explains why there is a statue of him in London, and it also explains why his books are covered in English literature lessons here in the UK. Personally, I think it's always best to be actually immersed in history if you want to watch an artistic interpretation of an event and enjoy it. I always find it interesting to see the Second World War through the very unfamiliar perspectives of the Soviet Union and also from the German perspective, surprisingly, as plenty of German soldiers actually admitted to Nazi propaganda deceptions that were created against the Soviet Union. Such propaganda was even taken by the United States when they rehabilitated Nazis after World War II and was used in the Cold War against the USSR. Combine that with the fact that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were two countries with totally different political, economic and class systems, then a lot of interesting stuff starts happening. The war between the Nazis and the Soviets was, if you really look at it, an essence of class struggle. Nazi Germany, contrary to the ridiculous claims of anarcho-capitalists and even some people on the so-called alt-right, was a capitalist country. Although the Nazi party's name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, it was far from socialist. We can see this by looking through history and seeing how under Nazi rule, there was an open suppression of communists and trade unionists, as well as the private ownership over the means of production, accompanied with the extreme anti-Semitism and racism and the heavy taxation of German workers. From the position of the ANCAPs and the alt-right, it seems like they think socialism is just when government does stuff. In reality, that's just not the case. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was the world's very first workers' state. It was a socialist country that collectivized means of production as well as agriculture. The means of production belonged to the working people in the form of either the state, meaning society as a whole, and also through cooperatives, where a group of workers would control the means of production in a factory or on a farm. Production was not for the purpose of one capitalist to make a profit, but to benefit the whole of society, and for a very long time, workers earned material wealth based on how much things they produced, rather than getting an hourly wage, which essentially is far more progressive in terms of production. There were two forms of ownership over the means of production in the Soviet Union: public ownership and collective ownership. Private ownership and exploitation had been abolished. Anyway, comrades, I'm gonna get right into this. The first things I noticed when I began watching the BBC television series World on Fire was that it portrayed how Britain intended to safeguard the independence of Poland from the Nazis. In order to shed some light onto this, we need to briefly look at the First World War and why it happened. The First World War was an inter-imperialist war between factions of rival powers who were fighting over territory. This is why I'm not in agreement whenever I read Lenin's analysis of the First World War as an imperialist war, which should be used by the working classes of the world to make a revolution in their own countries. Instead of turning their guns on the workers of other countries who were wearing different uniforms, they should turn their guns on their own ruling classes. After the defeat of Germany by Britain and its allies after the First World War, Britain ended up taking over much of Germany's colonial territories at the peace conference in Versailles. The former Turkish Ottoman Empire faced a very similar situation, as much of its colonial territories were divided into spheres of influence between Britain and France. Almost two-thirds of Britain's investments in other countries and half of its trade directly benefited the British Empire by the late 1920s. So it really is not a surprise that Britain wanted to maintain this status quo. It's also not surprising that Germany, Japan, Italy and Turkey, in other words, the imperialist powers which lost the most after the peace conference, were determined to hinder the status quo. Although Italy ended up joining Britain and its allies in the First World War, they too came out as the losers after the Versailles Peace Conference. However, they didn't receive as much as a blow or a kick in the teeth like Germany did. While the First World War was originally thought to be the war that would end all wars, it's not surprising to see that the Treaty of Versailles was kind of like the peace treaty to end peace. To properly understand what actually led to the outbreak of the Second World War and all of its horrors, we must look at the three following points. Number 1, the economic crisis. Number 2, the Treaty of Versailles. And number 3, the fear of socialism and the Soviet Union. After the Wall Street crash of 1929, a lot of tension started springing up in the capitalist countries, both within the capitalist countries themselves and also between rival capitalist countries trying to take over new markets overseas. It made war a possible outcome to be seen as a way to sort out the crisis and redivision of the world between the rival imperialist powers. The only country at the time which was not suffering from a crisis but rather had a booming economy and a greatly advancing industry was the Soviet Union. Since socialism has a planned economy and is a system where the means of production are collectively owned by the working class and where production is done to benefit the whole of society rather than for the benefit of one or a tiny minority of capitalists, we can see why socialism in terms of production and culture is far more progressive than capitalism. The economic crisis that was affecting the capitalist world was causing unemployment to rise dramatically, and it also caused discontent among the working class, which threatened the bourgeoisie to the point where there was an open suppression of workers. This suppression of the working class also caused communist movements to start operating underground. The main forms of foreign policy among the rival imperialist powers were war and more division of the world among spheres of influence. So it's really no surprise as to why fascism became favourable among the bourgeoisie at this time. This brings me to the victory of the Nazis in Germany. Although the working class being weakened by the fact that they were basically betrayed by the German Social Democratic Party was a huge contributor to the Nazis eventually coming to power, the weakness of the capitalist class against the working class was another huge contributing factor, as the German bourgeoisie could not exactly use any sneaky ways of suppressing the workers through parliamentary and representative bourgeois democracy anymore. So they needed to find a new way of suppressing the working people, which ultimately became the Nazis and their open suppression of communists and trade unionists. The Treaty of Versailles basically took away all of Germany's colonial territories, disarmed the country, and made the country confess that it was the imperialist power responsible for the First World War. This made the German people very angry. Therefore, the desire to change the judgment of the Treaty of Versailles was very strong among large sections of German society. The Treaty of Versailles almost totally disarmed Germany, as the country's military was not allowed to have more than 100,000 soldiers, accompanied with the prohibition of the use of tanks, aircraft, and submarines. As well as this, like I mentioned before, Germany's colonies were taken over by Britain, France, Belgium, and Japan. This included Germany's territories across Europe. The country's western territories were given to France and Belgium, their northern territory was given to Denmark, and their eastern territory was given to Poland. So, going back to when I was talking about the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, Britain and France did not go to war against Germany as a way of protecting the independence of Poland, but really to maintain the status quo, since Poland was, after all, in the sphere of influence of the British and the French. In other words, the Second World War was basically a continuation of the First World War. The third and final factor of the outbreak of the Second World War was the fear of socialism and the Soviet Union. As you already know, during the period of the Great Depression, when the workers of the capitalist world were facing destitution, the economy of the Soviet Union was booming and the country's industry was advancing. I even remember studying GCSE history at school, and when we looked at Germany and the rise of the Nazis, we kind of obscured the fact that the entire capitalist world was hurled against the Soviet Union. But one thing we were taught was about the non-aggression pact that was signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in August of 1939. There is also the emphasis of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the BBC television series World on Fire, and it's something that I have picked up on and want to shed some light on, since there are lots of misconceptions surrounding it. I want to first say that I'm definitely not here to deny that the non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was ever signed, as it would make me look very silly, since it is an objective historical fact that there was a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin, and it's all documented. However, what I am here to do is to try and at least correct the misinterpretation it had taught me before I decided to look more into Soviet history and Marxist theory that somehow or another the devastation of the Second World War was caused by this non-aggression pact. This misinterpretation was also put forward by the European Union's Parliament earlier this year, in which the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Second World War was being commemorated. The basis of the European Union's resolution was a shameful and disgraceful act of putting Stalin on par with Hitler and comparing the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. This is truly a kick in the teeth for the heroic soldiers of the Soviet Red Army, who not only did most of the fighting against the Nazis, but also suffered the most casualties. On top of this, it's also a kick in the teeth for all of the brave communist partisans all over Europe who formed resistance movements against Nazi occupation. As well as this, it is a kick in the teeth for anti-fascists all over the world who work tirelessly to disprove the ridiculous notion of how the immigrants are somehow taking jobs away, and it's also a kick in the teeth for ordinary workers who constantly struggle to find a way out of the crisis-ridden system of capitalism, which only creates a cycle of poverty, unemployment, and war. This misinterpretation also kind of prevents new generations of leftists from embracing socialism in a way, as I found it difficult enough to unlearn all of the misinterpretations and distortions of socialism that I had been taught, not just from school, but also from the mainstream media as well. It is also not surprising to see that this disgusting resolution was proposed by the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. Each one of these countries have very right-wing government. This resolution that was passed by the European Union also greatly disrespects the 27 million Soviet people who were brutally massacred and murdered by the Nazis. Many of these Soviet people were also victims of the Holocaust. Before I move on to give an overview of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, before this pact was signed in 1939, Britain had signed 3 pacts with Nazi Germany. One in 1933, one in 1935, and one in 1938. France had signed 2 pacts with Nazi Germany, one in 1933 and one in 1938. As well as this, Poland signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1934, and Latvia and Estonia signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in June 1939. On top of this, from all of the misinterpretations that were fed to me prior to deciding that I should look more into it, what the British ruling class obscures is that, to their shame, they, along with France, had totally agreed with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy that Adolf Hitler had the duty, or in fact the right, to divide up Czechoslovakia in the Munich Agreement that took place on the 30th of September 1938. What this resolution from the European Union, as well as the misinterpretations taught in British schools, also obscures is that the Western powers were the ones who refused to agree to an anti-Nazi alliance with the Soviet Union. In order for the Soviet Union to construct socialism, it needed peace. I heard a saying that really stuck with me, that it takes 2 hands to make a clap. The Soviet Union could not ensure that peace is safeguarded on its own. It also depended on other states for that. Therefore, to think that Joseph Stalin was a perpetrator of the Second World War is just ridiculous, as the Soviet Union didn't even want to go to war in the first place. It's as if the European Union and the ruling classes of Western Europe want us all to forget that the Soviet Union actually tried to prevent the Second World War from even happening. Let us not forget that it was actually Joseph Stalin who offered to send 1 million Soviet troops to the German border in order to prevent the Nazis from expanding and invading other countries to commit their acts of hatred and genocide against totally innocent people. If Britain and France had supported this proposal, it could have potentially stopped Hitler and the Nazis in their tracks, and World War II, combined with all of its horrors, may not have even happened. This proposal, however, was never put into effect due to Poland's hatred of the USSR. This was because Poland's hatred of the country did not let a Soviet deterrence force into their country. Let us not forget that the bourgeoisie of the imperialist countries that hated the Soviet Union were very friendly with the fascists of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Even the royal family, who before the Second World War were widely despised by large sections of the British working class, were also openly pro-fascist. Queen Elizabeth II also performed Nazi salutes in the 1930s. This is honestly not surprising, since fascism is essentially a naked form of a bourgeois dictatorship against the working class. In Nazi Germany, it wasn't long after the Nazis came to power that the first concentration camps began opening their doors, at which point the Nazis began rounding up communists, trade unionists, and Jews into them. As a matter of fact, the reason why the non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was signed in the first place was not because Stalin and Hitler were the best of friends. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union still hated each other. This pact was signed because Stalin was forced to sign it. He had no other choice. The Soviet Union was already facing a very difficult time due to diplomatic tension, so the non-aggression pact that Stalin signed with Hitler was really a defensive move. The only question that was raised over Germany's preparations for the war was which direction the Third Reich was going to head. It was the Soviet Union that was the final major power in Europe to sign a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, but the USSR did it due to all of the other options of forming an anti-Nazi alliance with the Western powers being rejected. In other words, the Soviet Union signed the non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany because Britain and France plain and simply refused to cooperate with them. This only meant that an opportunity was given to Stalin and the Soviet Union to prepare for the war that they could see was coming. It really does beg the question, was Britain and France pushing and even encouraging Adolf Hitler and the Nazis Nazis to attack the Soviet Union? Something tells me, yes, they were. It also explains why the relationship between the Western powers and the Soviet Union over the course of the Second World War was very complicated. After all, the Soviet Union, while it did fight against the Nazis with the Western powers in World War II, the alliance that the Soviet Union had was with the Comintern. If you don't know what the Comintern was, it was the international communist movement at the time. The Soviet Union really just had a non-aggression pact with the Western powers, and they worked together to destroy the Nazis. However, straight after the Axis forces were defeated, there were clashes between Soviet troops and troops from the Western powers. Winston Churchill even wanted to invade the Soviet Union immediately after the Second World War in his plan of Operation Unthinkable. The real anti-fascist fighters of the Second World War were the Soviet Red Army and the Communist Partisans. To the Western powers, the war against Nazi Germany was a war against a rival imperialist power. To the Soviet Union, the war against Nazi Germany was a war against a totally bourgeois dictatorship, an essence of class struggle and the war for the liberation of the working people, not just at home in the USSR, but also in Europe. It was a war to rescue the peoples of the world from fascist barbarism. It explains why after the Second World War, when the working class movement was becoming powerful and the Soviet Union was becoming a threat to the West, that the ruling classes here in Western Europe started handing over concessions to the working masses as a way of trying to pacify the proletariat in order to safeguard the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie.